Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Spiritual Wanderlust podcast. I'm your host, Kelly Deutsch, and today I am joined by the hermit, poet, and priest, Father Dave Denny. As a college student, Dave set out to be a journalist or perhaps a scholar of interreligious studies, but his plans were waylaid when he became a Carmelite monk for 30 years. Of course, surprise, surprise, the divine found other ways to fulfill his desires. And so over the years, Dave has written and edited for a magazine, co-founded an interspiritual foundation, and collaborated with many other interreligious leaders. And he currently lives as an urban hermit in Arizona and is working on his memoir. So Dave, I'm really excited to talk to you today. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, thanks, Kelly. It's wonderful to be here and finally meet you, as we said earlier, at least virtually.
Yes, indeed. I was hoping you could start us out today talking about that shift that happened. Like, you set out and you were thinking you were going to be a journalist, and then how did you end up becoming a Carmelite hermit? How did that path happen?
Yeah. Well, when I was in college, I was at Prescott College in Northern Arizona, and it was kind of, general liberal arts. And as you mentioned, I was probably thinking about journalism, something like that. But my roommate gave me a book, and he's the last person in the world I ever expect to suggest this book. It was called Seven Story Mountain by Thomas Merton. Now, this was the early 70s, and so we knew about Hindu mysticism, we knew about Sufism, we knew about transcendental meditation. A lot of gurus were coming over from India, Tibetan teachers, and I knew zero about Christian contemplative or mystical tradition. I was brought up in the Disciples of Christ, a Protestant tradition. So I grew up in a Christian family, but like a lot of college students, I wasn't really practicing anything in school at that age of 18, 19. So I read Merton, and I was just stunned. I thought all the monks in the universe had died in the Middle Ages or something. So it was a shock that there were monks, let alone, well, especially Christian monks, in the 20th century. So that was surprising. And then he was a writer. He was interested in literature, stuff like that. And he becomes a Cistercian monk. That was strange and intriguing to me. So I began to read more about him. A priest came and taught a class at Colorado College on the New Testament. He was a Jesuit priest. And I thought, well, I should learn something more about this tradition. So I took the class, and he knew about a retreat center, a monastery near Prescott called the Spiritual Life Institute, and it was in Sedona, Arizona. And I thought, oh, that's kind of like, what Merton was up to. Oh, maybe I should go check that out. So one winter, when it was Christmas break, I went over for like a 3 or 4 day retreat, and it was kind of love at first sight. I'd never been to Mass before, so I was, the Disciples of Christ had what they called the Lord's Supper every Sunday, which is not the case in a lot of Protestant traditions. So there was that sense of, the Eucharist, and my dad was an elder in the church, so occasionally he'd be up there on the altar with the minister and one other elder, and something about, I think that probably set me up in a way for then when I went to Mass. That was familiar on the one hand. On the other hand, that more Catholic sense of the real presence was just stunning to me. I mean, in a way, it's more kind of primitive, primordial in a way. It's like, whoa, this is something very ancient about that sense of this mysterious presence. So I used to then take breaks from school and go back on retreat every once in a while. I wanted to study Arabic and Middle Eastern history, which I couldn't do at Prescott. So I went down for the last 3 semesters I spent at University of Arizona here in Tucson. And but kept going back to Sedona on retreat. Then when I graduated mid-year. So I thought, okay, I've got like 6 months here. before I go to grad school, I again was thinking about journalism or comparative religion, and I asked if I could spend like a month in Sedona, and they said, "Oh yeah, okay." Then after a week or two, I said, "Well, how about another month?" And then that went on for 30 years. So
Just never left.
that's that's kind of how it happened. So
Ah.
it was, on the one hand, there was a continuity with my upbringing in Christianity, but on the other hand, there was something new and fresh. And I especially was drawn by a couple of other things. Merton, was very involved, like in the anti-war and civil rights movements. And this really fascinated me. I thought, wait a minute, here's this Cistercian. He's supposed to be out there thinking about the timeless, the eternal, the not at all involved in what we used to call the profane, because he was interested in the sacred. But I was fascinated by that. I thought, well, that makes, I like that. And the other thing about him was that then he was also involved in these interreligious dialogues. And because I'd had some exposure to other religions, that just seemed the way to go to me. And that combination of profound commitment to Christ, that instead of closing him down, opened him up, that to me was just wonderful. So yeah. I thought, wow, I'd like to pursue that path.
Yeah, talk to me a little bit about that, because I feel like that's such a juxtaposition in most people's minds of having, like,
right.
Becoming a hermit, getting lost in contemplation, and having a very rigorous prayer life. And then on the flip side, also being an activist. Like, what does that mean? And how do you combine those two desires and those two lifestyles?
Yeah, I think it's something that historically we still haven't resolved. And that's one of the things that's exciting about it to me, is that this is still kind of being worked out. I think the implications of the incarnation that's at the heart of Christianity are still being explored. I think that we fell into a kind of an artificial dualism somewhere along the line, and so that sacred profane thing was split. I think it's Wendell Berry and maybe Richard Rohr to talk about there's no such thing as sacred and profane. There's the sacred and the desecrated. And to me, that really strikes home that so those two worlds never really need to be separated, to the sacred and the profane, because that's really an unreal, it's kind of fictitious separation. So that's sort of, I guess, the philosophical background to why I don't see any problem with the two. I think what developed in the monasteries was a contemplative way of being associated with specific practices that people got the idea had no place in the so-called profane life, or the life of the world. And it became a kind of a specialized, contemplation or mysticism as something specialized that only professional monks did. So I think part of what we're trying to do, and this I got from, I think Jacques Maritain said he thought that one of the big focuses for the church in the 20th century and beyond was to get contemplation out of the monastery and into the streets. So that's one big theme that always had been captivating to me. And of course, the combination of, I know there's a guy named Matthew Eggemeyer who talks about the sacramental and the prophetic. These are two aspects of Christianity that also occur, of course, in Judaism and Islam. The prophetic, that history matters, history is important, time and space, flesh and blood, these are real, these aren't like illusions. And therefore, what we do, how we conduct ourselves in time and space, in politics, in our schools, that's all part of the sacred. And So we need to pay attention to that. And so I think that's those are some of the themes that kind of captivated me. Obviously, my life, I'm not much of an activist, but I do try to keep my finger on the pulse of what's going on, and also to point out things that I find hopeful. For example, this is Black History Month, and I just posted an article about John Lewis, the Congressman John Lewis, who kind of kept, took up much of the work of the civil rights movement of the 60s and continued it for decades. And so I don't know if I answered your question, but
Yeah, I'm curious too. As we're talking about your life, you've transitioned to some. I mean, when you were at the Spiritual Life Institute, there was some aspect of community to that, yes? Or was it completely like,
yeah.
I'm a hermit and...
Oh, yeah. The one of the things I loved about the part of falling in love with Christ and church and the Catholicism was the falling in love with the Carmelite spirit. And we were a Carmelite community. So there was always a balance historically in the Carmelites between solitude and community. When they came to Europe, that kind of broke down. In Europe, there was a kind of a suspicion, I guess, about a more solitary life. Community life was emphasized more. And so the Carmelites lost some of that. I think St. Teresa was trying to regain some of that. And of course, John of the Cross loved solitude and sought it out whenever he could. So the idea and the ideal was to look to somebody like Elijah, who was considered kind of the spiritual father of the Carmelites. And Elijah, as we know, spent a lot of time out in the desert in prayer. But then from time to time, the Spirit moved him to come out into the city and kind of disturb the status quo in a prophetic way. And then that links back to John Lewis. One of his favorite sayings was, "You need to get into good trouble sometimes." And there's where the prophetic thing comes in, standing up for certain values in the culture at large, and standing up for the poor, standing up for the marginalized, and reminding one another that that's really important. So in our community, the way that got lived out was we'd have like 2 or 3 days a week completely solitary, and then 3 or 4 days of the week when we would work together. So we might be gardening, it might be construction, it might be maintenance, it might be working on our magazine. There'd also be some time. We were always open as a retreat center. So each retreatant had a hermitage, a separate little hermitage. And we were open to some spiritual direction for people who came. So to me, that was a wonderful balance of solitude and community. And it kind of hones and polishes and balances you out in a wonderful way. You could you'd go a little nuts in too much solitude, although that would probably be one of my temptations. On the other hand, community can become distracting. And I know St. Teresa of Avila was such an extrovert, as is my friend Tessa Balecki, who's my next floor neighbor. She lives upstairs. That there's always the danger of getting too involved and missing out on some of that deeper inner life that comes with the silence and solitude. So I found it a great balance.
Yeah. I would be curious what your thoughts or advice would be to people who perhaps are relatively new on the contemplative path. And I'm wondering, especially, like, what do you know now about the contemplative path that you didn't know, let's say a few years into your life as a Carmelite?
Yeah. I think that because I pursued it so intensely and in such an unusual situation, there might have been a danger of thinking that's the only way to do it. The zeal that comes, I think we often talk about the zeal of the neophyte.
Yeah.
And I, in my old age now, I see the path as being wildly variegated.
Mm.
And different ways of looking at contemplation, for example, are coming out of the Black church. Uh, is it Barbara Holmes who talks about crisis contemplation?
Mm.
This is what happens. For example, in a lot of the mystical traditions, you have this sense that John of the Cross, like entering the dark night, entering the desert. This is something you do, something you choose, take up your cross. Whereas for other communities, such as Black Americans, you're not choosing the desert. Unfortunately, something unjust, something cruel has been imposed on you. Mm-hmm. And how do you deal with that? To me, that's probably another path toward contemplation. It's not one that anybody should have to undertake, but by the grace of God and miraculous grace, tremendous spiritual growth has come out of that, all those injustices. So it's not just a matter of going off into the desert voluntarily, although I do think that, based on my experience, it's really important for people to find chunks of time during their day. So if you're a busy parent, if you can get up a little earlier in the morning or stay up a little later at night to have that more reflective time, those little desert pockets are important, I think. I think that the occasional retreat time in a more silent, solitary, preferably wilderness environment can be really important to get that benchmark. I think that one of the things I notice about urban life is that it's much more anthropocentric. And living out in the wilderness, the human aspect is kind of the minority. And you're more aware of the plants and animals and the stars, and it's a whole different sense of how we are in the world that I think appeals to something very deep in us. So I would really encourage people, even though you're probably not going to go to a monastery, to look for those opportunities, take advantage of those. Quiet, solitude, wilderness, they're important. But also be open to the fact that locking yourself away in a cloister is not the only option.
Yes, and that is such a struggle, I know, for so many people, especially those who are, parents of young children, or, you work a 9-to-5 job, and all of that is so challenging to find time to just be still. And I know that there are chapters in life where it's like, you know what, there's just going to be less stillness right now.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's another art that has to be learned in our lives, is how to work out all those rhythms. And there is a season for everything. And I think the Indian tradition, as I understand it, is in some ways, I think, more realistic than in the West, in that there are stages of life. What housekeeper is one stage, but there's that sense that, but then it can be over, and then the more contemplative, the more specifically contemplative way of life can take over when you get older. I think that's maybe more theoretical than practiced. And of course, in our culture, it doesn't seem to happen often enough. But I think it's there as a possibility.
Yeah. What's so comforting for me is I regularly tell people about Teresa of Avila's definition of holiness, of just doing the will of God, and that I think that needs to be our touchstone more than just like, what's your contemplative practice? Because it's like, well, what is the will of God for you presently? Like, if you have 3 kids under the age of 5, like finding time for like a 20-minute sit every day might sound like a luxury, like if only, whereas on the flip side, if you are like retired, widowed, like
Right.
whatever your situation is, you might be invited into more times of stillness and
Yeah.
silence. And, it's figuring out like, what am I being called to in my present state?
Yeah. So I think, and I think the learning is very mutual. I think that,
Mm.
again, because there was this idea of there's the professional contemplative and then there's everybody else. I think that's breaking down. And so we're learning more and more by listening to people and learning more and more how people do manage to be
Yes.
more contemplative in the midst of raising kids. My heart always goes out, not having kids. Whenever I see kids like at the airport or just around town or just around the apartments here, I'm always excited. But then often I look at their parents and they're just, you can tell they're exhausted. This is not, they're not romantically thrilled with the mystery of childhood. They're like, oh my gosh, how am I going to get food on the table? And won't these
Right.
kids ever shut up and stuff like that. So it's,
Can I sleep through the night? Maybe. Yeah.
oh
It's
man, yeah.
a lot.
So my heart goes out. That's it's an heroic vocation.
Yes. Aren't they all?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to ask you a bit about too. I know a big turning point in your own life was being a foreign exchange student in the Middle East. And I was curious if
Yes.
you'd share a little bit about what happened there, why it was so powerful, and how that changed you.
Yeah. I I think I was still living in Kokomo, Indiana. That's where I grew up till I was 16. Then we moved to Arizona, and I had met some exchange students back in Kokomo, and some crazy reason I got it in my head. Wow, I think I'd like to do that.
Hmm.
So um, when I got to Arizona, I kept that idea. I applied with something called the American Field Service. That's I think it goes back to World War I. I think the American Field Service, they actually were stretcher bearers in the First World War, and they were, I think there was a kind of a pacifist dimension to them.
Hmm.
So I applied. I was studying French, so I probably figured, whoa, maybe they'll send me to France. That's probably what was in my mind as a teenager. Who knows? I'm an old man. I can't remember. But what I do remember is being a little surprised when Mom called me from school one day and she said, Dave, I found out where you're going this summer. I realized, whoa, this is it. I said, where? And she said, Afghanistan. And this is 1970. I'm 17 years old. So my first question, I hate to say, is, well, where is it? Unfortunately, we all know where it is now. It's hard for me I can't even wrap my mind around, it's been over 40 years of bloodshed and chaos there. So in a way, I always say, I guess I was there in the golden age because it was 9 years before the Soviets invaded. It was relatively stable. The king was in power. And the family I lived with was just wonderful. So kind, so welcoming. I felt really like a member of the family. We lived in a little neighborhood in Kabul near the university. And I was just captivated. And part of what struck me, I fell in love immediately with Arizona when we moved there. And then it's like 1 year later, I'm in Kabul, Afghanistan. And when the plane was coming down into Kabul, I thought, my gosh, this looks just like Arizona. But it was halfway around the world. So I was captivated by the landscape. People were just so wonderful. Again, I think that now we hear about Afghanistan, we hear about people like the Taliban. Well, that's like a foreign culture. That's not really Afghan culture. That's that's unfortunately young refugee men who grew up in Pakistan and were radicalized by some very conservative Muslim teachings that were really foreign to Afghan culture. So I loved it. And I had, I suppose, the most dramatic moment as I look back. I didn't know it at the time, but as I look back, we used to do homework with some local guys there. I couldn't speak much Persian, obviously, and they weren't great at English. we do algebra together. So that's the universal language. So that was one way of relating. And then these guys had America was just unimaginable. And it's hard for Americans to imagine that our life, many people, probably most people in the world, can't even imagine what it would be like. So it's really stressful trying to kind of convey what it is like. And the best I could come up with a brief description of my impression of what they were thinking was that America is like a cross between Disneyland and an Elvis Presley movie. So they just figured that's where I came from, and that's, who I am. And they loved that idea because it was just so exotic to them. So they were fascinated by having an American in their midst. But one day they did come up with a question they were puzzled by, because, well, this is this utopia. This is this wonderful place. The people are rich and they're free and do whatever they want. And they seem pretty nice. But these kids said, but why are you firebombing Vietnam? And it was like a sword had kind of cut right through me. And suddenly, and again, it took years for me to kind of interpret what was happening, but suddenly I was struck, first of all, probably by their vulnerability, which is something it is very difficult for an American to imagine. I remember Octavio Paz once writing about how, you don't have a whole lot of fear of Mexico and Canada in the United States, and you've got an Atlantic Ocean and a Pacific Ocean, on east and west. That's weird. Nobody in this world could imagine that kind of security. For most people, there's a radical vulnerability. And if Russia wanted to drop bombs on Afghanistan, why not? America wants to drop, why not? Who's stopping them? And so that really hit me. So their vulnerability, and then my complete inability to have any rational explanation for what we were doing in Vietnam. And 50 years later, I have no rational explanation. I don't know. You hear these arguments and they make no sense to me. So I think that is one reason, going back to, why do you go into the monastery? I think that I was being struck at probably for most people kind of an early age by the radical inadequacy of both our spiritual and political approaches to the world, and the schizophrenic nature that America is this generous nation that goes around the world doing some really violent things that we don't talk about, or we weren't talking about. So those were things. Then when Dr. King started talking about that, I remember, Muhammad Ali, the great boxer, says, "You're not going to send me over there to kill brown people or yellow people, people who are being treated the way my people were treated here in this country. Are you kidding me?" So there was this other perspective that started to come up. And so I guess part of what I was thinking is, whoa, I need to be transformed in some radical, profound way before I have anything to offer to this world. So I think that's part of what was going on with me.
Yeah.
So that was a big moment.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting to me how many of us have this catalyzing moment into the contemplative life where that usually is a moment of crisis or trauma or something about the world is not making sense, where it's your worldview is clashing with what's in reality. And it's something has got to change here. And it's probably me,
Yes.
That's a hard transition, but I think that's kind of where, we were talking about before, that dark night comes in, and the experience that we don't just like choose like, well, I'm gonna go do my duty and pick up the cross, and it's like, no, usually the cross finds you.
Yeah, yes, I think that's true.
Yeah.
Um, it's yeah, yeah. I think that that's one of those pitfalls of like taking up the spiritual life is yeah, like you're gonna do these ascetical things, and we used to say in our monastery, life will do it for you. So
Yes. Yes. That is
yeah,
very real.
so that
Yeah. One thing that strikes me about your experience in the Middle East is just how easy it is for most of the world to forget that like half of the major world religions started over there, you know?
yes.
And I'm curious, having spent time in Afghanistan and some of those areas and also doing interreligious work, like what about, I mean, it'd be interesting to hear your input also on like Judaism and Islam, but I'm curious specifically about Christianity. Like, what
Mm-hmm.
Middle Eastern qualities are there in Christianity that most of us forget about?
Yeah, that's a great question. Of course, people often talk about how the part of the wonder of Christianity was that it took this strong Semitic tradition and transplanted it into Europe, so that already with St. Paul, he
Mm,
was moving into Greece and that part of the world, and so there was this whole other heritage in Greek culture of philosophy, and so a lot of Western Christianity at least began to be translated into
mm,
Greek terms and Greek metaphysics, and we ended up the radical of the Middle Ages was Thomas Aquinas, and people were really upset because he was using all this Greek stuff. As now we think of him as hyper conservative, probably, but that was really revolutionary, and
mm,
so we were moving out of that more Semitic mind frame. And I think one of the things that you see more in Judaism, for example, is that I think that it is more incarnational.
mm,
I don't think there was as much of a split between like spirit and matter.
mm,
It's like, whoa, it's all one. Um, and so then we started splitting things up, heaven and hell, um, eternal and temporal. And I think those are very Greek tendencies,
mm,
but I know other cultures do it as well. The Jews didn't seem to do that as much. Even I loved an interview that Rabbi Abraham Heschel did uh, back in the 60s, I guess. It was on one of those national TV interview things. And the interviewer was saying, "Gosh, what's the deal, Rabbi? You're out there marching with Martin Luther King and protesting the Vietnam War, but isn't religion about the afterlife and the eternal and heaven?" And he just leans over and he says, "Well, we don't have a lot of information in terms of the afterlife. So what we do have is the prophets, and they say this is how we've got to live in this world. We've
mm,
got to be just. We've got to be compassionate, and we've got to take good care of each other. And then we're in God's hands." There's something kind of agnostic there that I've always kind of admired, actually.
mm, mm,
Um, and so, of course, in time of Jesus, there was that whole debate of whether or not there even is an afterlife. And some in that tradition, I think, would say, well, it's a little bit greedy. I mean, you get your 60 or 70 years. What do you want? And there's something about that, who do we think we are?
mm.
There's a kind of humility maybe in that. So I think the Semitic traditions had that kind of groundedness in the earth that I like.
Mm.
Um, and family, like the whole idea of celibacy never would have, that doesn't hold water in the Jewish tradition. It's kind of unusual, though, that Jesus seems to have been. Uh, but again, I think that I'm not saying one's right and one's wrong, but I'm just saying those are some tendencies I think that were there that maybe lost as we moved and became more Eurocentric.
Yeah, it is interesting even just to look at, like early desert mothers and fathers and, just some of those, like the Alexandrian tradition and Syria and, just how different churches were incarnate in different places is so fascinating to me to see how the rites were different. I mean, a lot of people don't know that, even within Catholicism, Roman Catholicism is only one of several rites, and it looks so different.
Of course, when I went on to study Arabic, I was thrilled then later when I became Catholic and found out there's a rite called the Melkite rite, and all the liturgies are in Arabic. And I used to have a tape in the old days of cassette tapes of a Melkite liturgy, and to hear these beautiful Christian chants in Arabic.
Yes.
I remember the one, what is it? Holy, holy, holy. Kudus, holy, holy Lord God of power and might. And to hear it in Arabic, whoa, it was kind of gave me the chills. And of course, you're hearing some of the timbre, I think, and some of the drama of the way Jesus would have been speaking. And because I'm fascinated by language, to me, how certain things you just can't translate. And I feel lucky to have had some exposure to Semitic language because there's just something visceral about that.
Yes.
That's quite wondrous.
When I studied in Rome with this religious community, I had classmates that were Maronite Catholics. They were Lebanese, and going to mass with them, I felt like it was like Aladdin goes to mass. Like everything was sung in these like minor keys. I was like, this is amazing, Or like I had a friend who was a Coptic priest, which is a rite in Egypt, and their tabernacle, usually like Roman Catholics, you have like a little gold box somewhere in a church, and their tabernacle was this like gold dove that was suspended above the altar, and he like pulled it down in the middle of mass, so it was like descending. I was like, this is so freaking cool, it's just the cultural,
that's drama.
The cultural incarnations and that drama that's added to it that I think is often lost in our kind of whitewashed European versions.
We used to struggle when we used to teach this class called Fire and Light, the history of Christian mysticism. We used to struggle with presenting. You want to present those desert fathers and mothers accurately, but it's unfortunate that for them, it's like the highest sort of spiritual state was what they called apatheia, which, this isn't what they meant, but in our ears, it sounds like apathy. But there's that tendency, let's slow things down, let's quiet it down. Whereas, in the Semitic traditions, there was a lot more of that more passionate engagement. And even in Greek thought, the passion was like a vice. Eros. The problem with eros is that it means that you lack something, whereas with agape, you've got it all, and you don't lack anything, and that's only for God. Whereas I don't think in most Semitic traditions that would not be an issue. A passionate engagement in life is a virtue. So,
I wanted to ask about your teaching experience because I know, you taught that class on mysticism for 13 years, and
I think it was,
taught all sorts of other interesting classes and retreats and different things over the years. And I'm curious, especially in your tenure in teaching, what shocked students the most? Like, what kind of preconceptions did they come in with, and then what left them just kind of mind blown or stunned, or kind of their ideas turned on their head?
There was one dramatic instance I could cite. There was a guy who had come from a very conservative, a more evangelical Christian tradition. And we didn't, of course, know this until much farther along in the course. that he had come in order to convert us.
Oh, okay.
Because he was quite sure that we were really way off base as Roman Catholics, and all that hocus pocus of mysticism and all that. That's like, that's demonic or something. Well, the poor guy, he just loved it, and unfortunately, he was very deeply shaken because he came into this thinking he was confronting the enemy, and he actually loved it. So that was one of the more surprising things that I ran into. I think, like me, a lot of students had no idea that monks existed anymore. So just that whole way of life was new. And of course, we had students it was wonderful. They were very curious. But I remember one student saying one day, well, my exposure to Christianity is I saw a televangelist once, and I went to a funeral, and I think that was about it. So you were some of the students, and this Colorado College. These are pretty astute people. But that was kind of a revelation to me that there's a lot of folks out there who just there's zero exposure to spiritual tradition. The other thing that was fascinating to us is that we were running into a fair number of students who were coming from what we might call kind of hybrid or hyphenated communities, where their parents, if they were involved in a tradition, they may have been in two different traditions. So you'd have a Catholic and a Jewish, spouses, and then the kids are kind of, raised in between those and not quite sure how to negotiate that. That was fascinating to me. I think that no matter who we're with, if it's retreats or with students, there's an amazing lack of knowledge about Christian mystical tradition. And the joke is, I don't know if Tessa ever mentioned this to you, but the joke is that once when we were at a Christian Buddhist dialogue up at Naropit in Boulder, Colorado, and back in the 80s, Tessa and Thomas Keating and Brother David Steindl-Rast were all talking about this mystical tradition. And some guy at the question and answer period gets up and says, well, wait a minute, I was brought up Roman Catholic. I never heard any of this. Is this heretical or what? And it was hilarious because they had an Orthodox priest there too, a Greek Orthodox guy. And so they had this sort of mock trial of Tessa as a heretic, and they decided she was cool. She was definitely Orthodox, and they made a kind of a joke of it. But that's interesting to me that this is, it's becoming more and more known, my impression is, but still.
I think it's the best kept secret in Christianity, like that there is this mystical core. And I think there is in any major world religion, that there's a mystical heart to it. And there are plenty of different forms and sometimes unfortunately, go ahead.
But I think then that is the key to interreligious dialogue. I think that it's not going to happen unless it is coming out of that more contemplative experience, which involves being radically encountered by and encountering something that's so awesome, so mysterious. It so shapes you at the core of your being that you just don't have words for it. And suddenly you do have to get humble and realize, whoa, there's a lot we don't know. And that's a great place for dialogue.
Yes. When like language is stripped away.
Yeah. And you can't weaponize that. That's the beauty of it. You can't hit anybody over the head with that. You end up serving people and listening to them. So that's why that's to me the hope of the future. And you don't have to sacrifice any of your own identity. I know there's all these questions about, well, is anybody going to be just one religion in the future? I don't know. But for me, I just keep falling more and more deeply in love with Christ. But my impression is he's falling deeply in love with all these other traditions, and that's why it's happening to me too, and that's fine. I don't.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it seems like the divine spark at the center, I mean, at least in my opinion, is one and the same. And that's why, people who are closer to that center, like two mystics of different religions, have far more in common than a mystic and a fundamentalist of the same religion.
Yeah, yeah, that's a really important, I think, insight. I think you or cousins maybe talked about that some, that it might be artificial to say, well, there's Jews and Christians and Muslims and Buddhists. That what it might be more helpful to talk about, yeah, is it fundamentalist? Is it kind of mainstream? Is it more contemplative? And if the more contemplative it is, the more I think the open doors to dialogue, because you've just been knocked off your high horse, and you're ready to listen and learn. I've only seen a clip, but I've heard people talking about there's a film, what's it called, Mission Joy, that's dialogues between Archbishop Tutu and the Dalai Lama. And just the clips I've seen, it's just wonderful. They're laughing, they're got their arms around each other. There's this beautiful camaraderie between them. And I think that's a great example of what happens.
Yes.
So,
yes.
So you become more Christian, I think, as you encounter these other traditions, not less. It's not a matter of watering something down. It's a matter of, it's more like permaculture, when you think about biology, and that's my kind of paradigm. Monocultures, they're just, you plant corn, you live on corn, there's a blight, you're dead. But if you've got an almond tree, and you've got some pomegranates, and you've got some grain, and you've got, all of these things synergistically work together, and they all get healthier and healthier. And that's, to me, where the life is. So
it's a great image.
It's funny, I think there's that sense of Islam as being so close-minded, and yet of all scriptures, there's a great line in the Quran about, well, God created us so that we could get to know each other. And it was different traditions, different languages, and wouldn't it be nice to get to know each other? And I just think that's a wonderfully anti-clannish approach.
Yes, totally. I wanted to save a little bit of time to ask you about your poetry, because I think that's there's something, I mean, obviously very different between like your original intent of being like a journalist and the writing style that you use in poetry. They're very different mediums. And I'm curious what role poetry has played in your spiritual life in particular.
Yeah. Well, it's I love the sound of words. It's kind of embarrassing. When I was a little kid, I don't remember this, but I guess I made up my own language, and my brother was my translator.
That's amazing.
Anyway, so and I still remember, I mean, little like ads that were on the radio or TV when I was a little kid, and I'm shocked I remember this, and I realized it's part of the power of words. And of course, advertisers know about that, and they manipulate us. But the real power that comes through somebody like a Shakespeare, it's just, wow, it transports you when you hear it. It's like kind of music, and it can be kind of incantatory. So those are things about it that I love. I also love the fact that it's sort of the most primitive language in any culture, and at the same time, it's really the most exalted. And to me, that's so incarnational. It's like bringing together heaven and earth in these words. So I think it also does a great job of short circuiting our rationalism. And reason is so important, but sometimes I think we can idolize it. And so there's a lot more to life than equations and logic.
Yes.
And I think that, again, what was it? Pascal said, reason, the heart has reasons that reason knows not. And that poetry has a way of taking us out onto that frontier where some of those distinctions start to fall apart. I also think Karl Rahner once said, whatever happened to all the singing theologians? And that always struck me, that it should be about song. It should be about wonder. Instead, it became a system that you have to judge as to whether it's orthodox or not. And if it's not, off with your head.
Yeah, right.
That's not very encouraging. So I think part of what's beautiful about poetry is that you don't have to, there's no orthodox or unorthodox about it. And it speaks right into the heart of the messiness and the mystery of being human.
Yes,
so
I love that Dostoevsky quote that beauty will save the world. And
yeah.
It's that kind of fierce beauty that's like you said, it short circuits that rational brain. I mean, we spend so much time in our left brain, the analytical, so to go into like the right brain and not have to, I don't know, like you think of the transcendentals, goodness, truth, and beauty. Like, I think for so long we've been stuck on truth, basically since the Reformation. We're like, let's argue this and like subpoint A and subpoint 3.1 point, and it's like, oh my gosh, like who cares? Like, can we please encounter the holy, like through something that is so visceral that you just can't escape it?
Yeah. Amen.
Yeah.
I think, I used to read Hans Urs von Balthasar.
Yes.
Who I probably understood 10% of what he was saying. But he emphasized that just what you're saying, that we got so obsessed with the true in terms of analysis and reason, and then also the good in terms of moral behavior, which is extremely important. But then there's the moralism that people hate about religion. But the beautiful has been somewhat ignored, he felt.
Yes.
And that's where I want to spend my time.
Yeah.
So
have you heard that story? I mean, I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, but I heard a story told of von Balthasar during the Second Vatican Council, that he was there with all these theologians and that he like stormed out of one of the sessions and just like slammed the door saying, "There's no eros in it." Just left.
Oh, that's great.
I love it.
Oh, I never heard that. Yeah, I like that a lot. Yeah, that sums it up.
Yes.
So
anyway, before we close, would you mind sharing one of your poems with us and kind of invite us into that space of beauty?
Yeah. Okay. I'm trying to think what might be the best. Maybe this one I'll do because I wrote this during Advent. And Tessa and I get our hair cut at this place where there's a young woman named Angie who works there. And every year at Christmas, Angie's mom makes tamales. That's a big deal in this part of the world. Christmas is the time for tamales. So we ordered some tamales from Angie's mom. And I had a kind of epiphany when we showed up at the salon, and Angie comes from the back room, walking up between all the stylists' chairs, where they were cutting people's hair. And she's got this arm full of fresh tamales. And I guess in my crazy mind, I was thinking this is like an offertory procession in the mass, when you
Mm.
bring the gifts up to the altar. And so I had a kind of a crazy experience of that. So then afterwards, Tessa and I um, went over. It was dark. It was getting close to uh, Christmas time, and a local Lutheran church has a living nativity that
Hmm.
they do, and you drive. It's drive-through, a drive-through nativity. So you stop at different stations, and then there's the wise men and the shepherds and then the Holy Family. Well, there was a lot of people lined up to see the nativity scene. In the meantime, we're sitting in the car with these hot tamales, and they're filling the car with aroma. And so that's sort of the context here.
Great.
Advent meditation, offertory. I love the Cactus Blossom Salon, but this was brand new. I wasn't getting shorn. Rudolph was running on the radio while Angie retrieved our order from the back room. She emerged and began her offertory procession down the center aisle. Between the swiveling pews, scissors went silent. Her thick black hair tumbled over her shoulders, and in her strong brown arms, she cradled 24 green chili pork tamales, her mother's creations, wrapped in foil, bagged in plastic, and warm as life. My friend Tessa took them gently in her arms while I fumbled with a wad of bills. We drove through the dark and joined the queue of cars waiting to enter the Lutheran drive-through living nativity. The interior grew redolent. We had no napkins, no plastic cutlery. We gave in, fingers anointed in lard, illuminated by tail lights we received. I think I'm in love with Angie's mother, I blurted. I hope her father doesn't own a gun.
That's wonderful. I love the richness, the fingers in the lard, like anointed, but like warm as life. Like there's something wonderful about that is one of the reasons I think that I feel like I could never really leave Christianity, is just that incarnational quality,
Yeah,
the messiness, the sacramentality of everything from, the lard on your fingers
yeah,
from the tamales to everything else.
yeah, yeah, and just this kind of warmth and humor about it
Mhm.
that I love. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, beautiful. Well, thank you so much for sharing your
Thank you.
stories and your life experiences with us. I think it's such a joy to be able to walk together for a pace.
Yeah, this was wonderful. I, I, uh, I really enjoyed it.
Yeah. If any of our listeners want to learn more about what you're up to, or Sand and Sky, where you're at presently, where should people go?
Yeah, sandandsky.org is the website for the Desert Foundation, which is the little nonprofit that Tessa and I co-founded. And then Tessa has her own site called tessabalecki.com. And so there's a lot of overlap between the two. And then if you go to Tessa's site, you can also connect to our new podcast called Fire and Light. And it's basically conversations on life, love, and soul.
Mm.
So there's one currently available, actually a second one right now has just become available. So the first one kind of introduces us, and then this new one is a combination of celebrating Candlemas, which is celebrated on February 2nd, And also we talk a little about Black History Month.
Beautiful. Yeah, I look forward to checking that out and encourage everybody else to as well. There's a lot of wonderful things happening at the Desert Foundation.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you again for joining us, and thank you everyone for listening today. We so appreciate it and hope you'll tune in again next time.